So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin the first 10 minutes. I'm just going to give you a bit of a taster around an ARC project I've just finished up, because it's a project that raises some of the issues I then want to reflect on, and then I'll leave 10 minutes for comments, questions and so forth. So this is the project that we're just finalising the outputs on. It's called Young People, Sex, Love and Media. And it was a 3-year study funded by the Australian Research Council, and the project aimed to discover more about how young Australians aged 12 to 17 are learning about sex, love and relationships from popular media, which we discovered was largely social media these days for them, and anyone here with teenage kids or, you know, who've got friends who've got teenage kids will know what I'm talking about there. We also wanted to know where they thought the gaps were for them, and to bring their voices into debates about what they need from parents, educators and policymakers. Now, we also interviewed adult stakeholders in education, youth work and allied fields to understand their concerns and views about young people's needs. And I did the fieldwork in this project in 2014, and we did focus groups in 5 high schools, fairly diverse high schools. And we interviewed students twice in groups of 5 or more, and so we went back to each school twice, in other words, for follow-up. We divided the focus groups into 13 to 15-year-olds, 15 to 17-year-olds. So I'm going to share some of the findings, partly because I find them fascinating and, you know, somewhat entertaining. Having 2 boys aged 13 and 16, I feel I'm finally getting some information about their world, because they certainly don't give it directly to me. And here are some of the things we found. And I think anyone who's done qualitative research with young people, it's fabulous research to do. It's a privilege. And it's kind of constantly amazing to me how if you get them on topics that they really want to talk about, they will talk. You know, even to a sort of middle-aged woman in a fictional lab coat, they'll open up, and they were very, very frank about some of these issues. So family, that's kind of my metaphor for what a lot of kids feel, probably my children particularly, about talking to their parents, particularly about sex and social media and things where parents have understandably high anxieties often, or lack of understanding. So here are some of the things they said about family. One of the interesting things was that, so these are some of the contentious things that, you know, as members of Ethics Committee should immediately recognise that there are some tricky areas here. So pornography was something that came up very spontaneously with the guys. The girls talked about it a little bit too, but obviously porn is very, very accessible online these days. And the boys, one of the interesting things in qual research is you get to hear a little bit about not just what they access or what they do, but how do they feel about it? And one of the things that was very apparent was a lot of the guys were very aware that there was a discourse out there around them being predatory, and if they looked at pornography, they'd never have a proper relationship with a woman. And so this is kind of representative of how a lot of them saw the relationships in their family around pornography. A lot of them said, well, you know, Dad knows I look at it, but he just says clear your history. So, I don't know what that says about Dad, but anyway. You know, but then, you know, that sort of comment, like if Mum catches me, she'll belt me. On the other hand, this is good, you know, parents as trusted sources. I'd say about, you know, rough estimate, about 20% of the kids said that they would talk to their parents about relationships and sexuality and these things. So it wasn't all bad news. I like the oversharing. That was a big topic. You know, if they try to offend you on Facebook, my deal with my parents, like I have to be friends with my mum, but she can't like any of my stuff. She can just be there to see what I like. Like I don't like a heap on Facebook, but she can be there to see what's happening, but she can't be known as my mother. I love the way they phrase things. They're just gorgeous. Oh, okay, now, little warning here. This is about masturbation. I'm sure everyone's okay with that topic. But this is kind of weird stuff that parents do. Oversharing. My mum, this is a 16 or 17-year-old girl. She was upstairs with her girlfriends. My mum tried to talk about female pleasure. I was upstairs and she was downstairs. She just calls me on the phone, this is, and hopes, I hope you masturbate and I hope you've had an orgasm. I was like, what? She just hung up and I was like, what just happened? So I just had to throw that in because it's kind of a hilarious thing for a mother to do, rather gorgeous. Schools, sex education, and this is the depressing part. Again and again we heard this. They know all about the protein coating on the AIDS virus. They know all about what goes where. They know how to put condoms on bananas. But the sort of overall message is that sex is something which is dangerous, it's risky, you'll get diseases, you'll get pregnant. There seems to be almost no discussion of pleasure or agency in that conversation. Sexting's a big one. There are estimates between 70 and 90% of older teenagers sext, which really just means often flirtatious images or messages. And very, very clear, one of the things that was concerning on an ethical level is the double standard around gender that still goes on, the way that girls get shamed and blamed for this stuff. And the girls are sort of getting better at working out how to negotiate that space. They often send jokey, the boy will ask for a sexy image and the girl will send a jokey something. They kind of play with it. Peers are really important for communication around sex. That's where they do a lot of their learning, is peer-based learning, which, isn't always the most helpful place to be learning these things. So at least they are, talking about it together. Pleasure, again with schools, if they talk about relationships, they should say we should be happy and treated well, but not about good sex, not what's involved, not how to communicate. So friends are really important, and I think we all know that about adolescents. This again is about double standards. There's a lot of pressure on guys to ask girls out, and the girls are just like, if you ask a guy out, like, you're really confident, but then it might look like you were desperate. And I was thinking, my God, nothing's changed since the 70s when I was a teenage girl. It's a bit depressing. Advice, yes. So that, again, this reinforces the peer stuff. I won't go into that because that's a complex area, but it's about how young men use humour to shock and bond, and they think that they think at times they're taken at face value. So gross out humour and shocking stuff is very much the language currency of young men. So that's just a taste. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that are obviously raised by that project. The risks, which you'd all be very cognizant of. So I think the big question is, particularly when you've got the younger age groups, there's a risk that they'll be exposed to new information. And you don't want to be, as the researcher, giving them new information, or maybe their peers will start talking about things that they're uncomfortable about, or they don't feel they're at a stage or age where they really want to know about that. So the way that, and I think one of the messages, takeouts for me, having done quite a bit of work with young people, is there is no fail-safe approach to this. You can always get into deep water quickly, accidentally. So the way that we dealt with this was we only had kids in focus groups who had formal sex education. Obviously there was parental consent forms as well as, information sessions for students and parents. At the beginning of each focus group, I spent about 5 minutes talking them through the ethics of what we were doing here, about that what's said in the focus group should stay in the focus group, that I didn't want them to talk about their own personal any personal information. I didn't want to know about their, whether they were sexually active. I didn't want to know about anyone else. That we wanted to de-identify things. We were talking about issues, not individuals. And then, of course, I had school counsellors on hand. It didn't turn out actually that anyone needed counselling, but that was always a concern for me. That topics could come up and a student could walk away feeling embarrassed or upset, so that's one of the obvious risks in sexuality in young people research. There's always, of course, the disclosure of criminal behaviour. So there are complex laws around the laws that at the moment frame sexting, the behaviour of sexting, are really designed to catch pedophiles. So, that's very problematic, and so it's actually a criminal offence, a serious criminal offence for, a 16-year-old girl to take a photo with a top up, send it to an 18-year-old boy, she's produced child pornography, he possesses it, she's distributed it. I mean, it's, you know, it's kind of nuts. So there's always the risk that someone's going to disclose criminal behaviour, and of course there's a and there could be a disclosure of child abuse, which is mandatory reporting, and then there's the vicarious trauma, which also concerned me if someone's talking about something that distressed them and maybe something's happened in this other person's life. So I was cognizant of those things, and I'm interested in, when we have a conversation, to know a little bit more about, you know, your reflections on this, because I wouldn't say I have a fail-safe approach to it. So I just want to talk now briefly about, I guess, some history about young people and how they've been seen in ethics procedures. And actually, if anyone's interested, I've got with my co-researchers on this project I just showed you, we've got a paper on the ethics of researching with young people in press at the moment. And I'm happy, there's an association, and I'm happy to distribute a link to that article when it's published. Might be interesting if things are coming up for you. So traditional conceptions of young people in ethics procedures, you know, and this is really traditional stuff, understood them to be developing adults. That is, in their developing state, young people were seen to be fundamentally incompetent research subjects, lacking the communicative and cognitive abilities to participate properly in research. So that's a very traditional sort of view. Childhood has often been understood as a knowable biological entity, best observed through quantitative methods in lab settings. So one of the issues is that a lot of research traditionally or historically has really been done by people in the sciences. Nothing wrong with the people in the sciences, but it's a much more emergent field if you were looking at qual research, qualitative research, and we're looking at areas like cultural studies, youth studies, and so on. A related research framework saw young people as innocent or weak and therefore in need of special protection in research. Now, while researchers who favoured, I guess the way I'd parse this is, while researchers who favoured a developmental paradigm took a dim view of young people's capacities at times, researchers who favoured a model of young people as innocent took a dim view of their resilience. So I think those two sorts of frameworks have been quite structuring in this area. For both these reasons, it was common practice to bypass young people altogether in research that concerned them, particularly around sensitive issues such as sexuality. And so the practice was often to ask adult proxies rather than to get them to report on young people's experiences and views. Now, what I want to do is really just flip the paradigm a bit and to say, yes, acknowledging all the risks there are that doing this kind of research with young people, I think I want to talk about, well, what's at stake ethically if we don't do this kind of research? So that, you know, for some people they might say, well, if you don't engage young people in qualitative research of this kind, there aren't any ethical issues, they don't arise. However, the past 2 decades have shown across the research field that there are in fact problems with this approach, and that we might even consider it unethical to silence young people's contributions to research that concerns them. To start with, there is the simple practical issue that nobody knows who a young person is. And I won't go into all the legal stuff, but if you look across state and federal law in Australia, you know, the age of, the age of criminal, mens rea, criminal capacity to commit a crime is 10 in many instances. But there are many contexts in which you're still considered a child until you reach 18. The age of consent is 16. You know, it's a very uneven field. How do we define young people is already quite problematic. So recognising that the category of young person is a cultural one that can shift between social and other frameworks or contexts, rather than a simple biological fact, challenges our ways of thinking about the characteristics of young people within research. Over the past 20 years, interdisciplinary work under the umbrella of childhood studies has begun to present a very different picture of who young people are. in ways that have important implications for research methods and ethics when we're exploring sensitive issues. Childhood and adolescence are now understood as complex entities that are socially constructed, not biologically predetermined. And I would strongly argue that despite the difficulties, the sort of ethical perils in these areas of research, it is an important ethical principle, and indeed I think a kind of addressing a human right of young people to give them voices and to find ways to safely involve them in research. Of course, you can't elide the power dynamics which arise when adult researchers are in a room with children or young people. Often you're doing it at schools. You're doing it in very institutionalised settings because they're seen as safer places, and I think in many ways they probably are. However, that sends a powerful message already, and you're always thinking, are they telling me what they think I want to hear? Because you're a teacher, in a way, you're in a teaching kind of setting. That's how you'll be seen. So I think that one of the approaches that I try to have in my research there is to be self-reflexive, to constantly be kind of reflecting on what's happening, reflecting on my practice, which sounds to an ethics committee a bit like trust me. And I've got to say, I think ethics committees are incredibly valuable tools for researchers. Researchers often whinge about, it takes so long to get something through ethics. But actually the process of putting in ethics applications and getting good feedback from your ethics committees, to me, is part of the research. It's a critical part of a self-reflexive process and an informative process. Now, I'm finishing up here, but a key area of debate in this whole field about ethics and research in young people is whether or not young people should be regarded as similar or different from adults. Well, I think that's a black and white way of looking at it. A current consensus across a lot of research in this field suggests that they are in fact both. Young people are just as competent as adults in their own way, but also in need of particular care. So I think of it all the time as a juggling act. Ethical approaches to qualitative research with young people about sensitive issues, I would argue, require a delicate balancing act between minimising harm while respecting the need to learn about young people's experiences and hear their voices. So in conclusion, I want to argue that although qualitative approaches may on the surface appear to raise more challenging ethical issues than traditional quantitative research methods, we could look at it another way and say that perhaps such research can in fact be more ethical as it allows for the agency of young people to be recognised and allows their voices to be heard on issues that affect them. Thank you.
I do research in the field of disability, and a lot of what you were saying about children has actually been applied to adults with intellectual disabilities. And I wondered how ethics committees might start to apply some of what you were saying, because historically it's usually a proxy that's included instead of their own views.
Yeah, look, I think that's right, and I think, I think we're sort of, in a very positive sense, the research fields have gone through a process of enfranchising people that were often seen as people who needed speaking on behalf of. And, you'd know much more about this because this is your area, but there is that idea of discourses of protection, which I think very easily bleed into discourses of control. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, and I think we've got to watch that elision.
I was really interested in your comment around agency and youth in the agency of the research, and it was what I'm going to say really came from discussion at the end of the AEN meeting that we had at University of Sydney last year, and that was involving young people on our ethics committees, and in terms of that agency in research, also agency in those ethical decisions. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I feel very positively about that. I think, there's a kind of, there's a movement in some of this kind of research to talk about young people as co-researchers. Now, I'm wondering if that's perhaps effacing the real power differential, which you really cannot get around. I actually think what you're talking about is actually a terrific idea, because I think that getting the voices of young people in at that level, like I was saying, the value of ethics committees. Because otherwise, really, in a way, you default to the adult researcher, which is kind of what I'm arguing against in the first place. So I think that would be a terrific move.
Catherine, thanks for that. I'm interested in the mechanics versus relationship sort of characterisation of what young people learn about sex. It's almost like there's a kind of preventative theme in that. So do you have any sense from research about what parents would be happy with in terms of, say, talking about the positives of relationships?
Yeah, well, of course, that's really the rub. I mean, talking to lots of teachers, a lot of the secondary school teachers who are involved in sex ed, and I've given a lot of talks at schools as well to parents and teacher groups, and the teachers actually are often quite progressive, I think. It's because they're with the young people day in, day out, and the message is that a lot of young people in our society are not comfortable talking to their parents for various reasons, and the parents aren't comfortable talking to the young people. So, but the problem for schools is that if they introduce this kind of information, the parents are going to arc up. So it's a bit of a vicious circle, really. I just think it's astounding that in discussions of male pleasure, well, they happen anecdotally in the playground all the time, but the clitoris still isn't discussed in sex education. I mean, that's kind of nuts, I think.
How do you deal with the kind of possibility that people might disclose illegal information? I mean, some illegal things that they might disclose are terrible and obviously would need to be dealt with, but if you're dealing with kind of 15, 16, 17-year-olds, presumably there's a reasonable chance, I don't actually know what the age of consent is in Australia, but presumably there's a reasonable chance that you'll get people who are just underage disclosing that they've had sex with their girlfriend or boyfriend who are the same age. How do you deal with that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks for raising the elephant in the room. Well, it depends on what they're disclosing. And I mean, I feel that I do have an ethical obligation as a researcher. I think there's a real judgment call to be made there. And some things are mandatory reporting, but in some instances, look, the police, unfortunately, a lot of this stuff lies with the discretion of the police, because some of the laws do not reflect the reality of the age of sexual activity and they don't reflect the reality of consent. So I suppose as a researcher I would be very reflective about at what point do I notify the principal about something, and that would be where it appeared that there was no consent, there was abuse, there was in fact highly unethical behaviour, and I would think about maybe whether I'm going to identify the actual person in the group or whether I say this conversation's been, so what would be the best practice approach? I mean, I don't think the best practice approach all the time would be saying to the police that you think there's been...
Do you warn them in advance there?
Yes, absolutely. And I say, look, here are the areas that... And that's why I say I'm not interested in if any of you have been involved in any kind of, kissing or flirting or... maybe even actual sex. That's not what we're here to discuss. We're talking about attitudes, we're talking about where you learn about these things, not what you're doing, I mean, underage drinking, I mean, they anecdotally disclose that. Well, I'm not going to go to the principal and say, did you know that your 15, 16-year-old students are drinking? Because the principal would laugh at me and say yes, So, that's a judgment call, I suppose.